Oh, you get it up on the screen and then you share it. Okay.
Good evening and namaskar. We welcome you to the second episode of the lecture series to commemorate Azadi ka Amrit Mahotsav. Today, we are very pleased to have Dr. Colin San over this lecture series. She's the Chicago-based author and a culinary historian. Before she joins us for this lecture, I would request Honorable Counsel General Shri Amit Kumar for brief remarks.
Thank you, Ranjit. I'm very happy to join this lecture on Indian culinary contributions to the world as part of our lecture series. As you all know, we are commemorating the 75th anniversary year celebrations of our independence as Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. As part of these events, we conceived of the lecture series as a format to introduce to the wider audience in the United States specific and unique facets of India, including our history, cultural heritage, as well as our culinary contributions to the world. Turning to the topic for today, when you talk of Indian food, it is more likely that people talk or conjure images about spices or think of samosas or chicken tikkas. A common misconception is that Indian food is very spicy or hot. Admittedly, some regional food is quite hot, but there are several spices that provide a wonderful blend of aromas and add texture to the food. I can think of no better person than Miss Colleen St. Taylor to speak on the subject of our culinary contributions to the world. She is also the author of a fascinating book on food history environmental and sociological impacts on food. Indian cuisine comprises several regional and traditional cuisines and influences which are native to the Indian subcontinent. This is not surprising given the diversity in climate, culture, ethnic groups, and occupations, and the use of wide variety of locally available spices, herbs, vegetables, and fruits. I have had the opportunity to also interact with Ms. Colleen Sen and her husband, and to learn about their journey in the US since the early 70s. Their story, and indeed stories of several other Indians who came to the US in the 60s and 70s, must be told and documented. But that is a topic for another time. It would suffice for me to say that exciting work is also happening in that area. With those words, I would like to welcome Ms. Colleen Sen for her presentation on the Indian contribution to the world food scenario. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank Consul General Kumar, Consul Singh, and the Consul General of India for inviting me to give this talk on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of India's independence. I also want to thank the three discussants, Professor Rebecca Manring, Dr. Bruce Craig, and Monica Eng, who will be introduced later. Today, my talk is going to be on a subject you don't hear very much about, which is India's culinary contributions to the world. We all know the story about how Vasco da Gama came to the Malabar coast in search of spices, and how the trading posts of the Portuguese and Spanish empires became the hubs of a global exchange of fruit, vegetables, and plants between hemispheres. Food historians refer to this exchange as the Colombian Exchange. And you can see this map shows you how foods and ideas and goods and medicines went back and forth. And India was really at the center of this hub. But we hear a lot about the dishes that were imported, the things that were imported into India, such as potatoes, tomatoes, pineapples, chili peppers, but we don't hear very much about what went the other way, about India's gastronomical contributions to the world. So today I'm going to take you for a very brief culinary voyage in time and space to show how India may have been the most influential force in shaping the way the world eats today. And you can see this influence is apparent in many areas, in ingredients, in plants, in techniques, in specific dishes, and in ideologies. This starts with the Indus Valley Harappan civilization, because from ancient times, India has been part of the global economy. It's always been the center of a great network of land and sea routes that with the rest of the world. And not so much is known about this civilization. It's sort of parallel to the Mesopotamia civilizations, but basically it covered over 1 million square miles in Pakistan, parts of Pakistan, and northwest India to Gujarat, right to the shores of to the borders of New Delhi. And archaeologists have discovered over 1,500 villages and small cities and 5 very large urban areas, one of which was Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, which is one of the names for it. Today, much of this region is desert, but in ancient times, it was very fertile and forested and very affluent. It was a commercial society, and it had trade with Central Asia, with Mesopotamia, with the Arabian Peninsula. And one of their main exports was spices, turmeric, cardamom, and pepper. And signs of an ancient pepper trade have been found as far as Egypt, where peppercorns were found in the nostrils of the mummy Ramses the Great in the 2nd millennium BCE. And this is another picture showing the various trade routes that went to Egypt and all the way to Arabia. They found relics in Oman, and there was just a lot of, and India's always been part of this global trade. Now, what did the Indus Valley people eat? This gives us an idea of what plants were native to India. And these were some of the plants that were found at a site at Farman in the state of Haryana between 2600 and 2200 BCE. Wheat, barley, rice, millet, eggplant, brinjal, and that's one of the that is native to India, the mango, sesame, probably bananas, and ginger, turmeric, sedge, and garlic. And what I'm going to do now is look at a few of these foods that we came from India and actually entered our own diet. And the first one, of course, is the eggplant. And the Sanskrit word for eggplant, vatigan, gave rise to the Hindi and then to the Persian vatajan, and that is the source of the words for eggplant in most languages except English, where it was named another way, such as berenjena and the French aubergine. And the eggplant came from India, came to Persia, and then it was taken by the Arabs to the Mediterranean and Europe, and from there the Spaniards took it to the New World. So now eggplant is grown everywhere around the world, including my own garden in Chicago. And another vegetable that's native to India is the bitter gourd, or Karela. Monica Eng and I have had a lot of discussions about this because it's becoming very fashionable now in the West because of its health benefits, especially for diabetes. So that's another thing we owe to India. A fruit indigenous to India is the mango. The word mango comes from the Dravidian manke, and it originated in northeastern India, and it's being bred selectively to improve its taste and remove fiber. Again, this was taken by the Portuguese and Spanish to the New World, and now thousands of varieties of mangoes are grown all around the world. And another fruit, which you see at the bottom, is the jackfruit, and the jackfruit from the Malayalam chaka, and that's another fruit that's become universal. Now, rice is an interesting story. It used to be that the belief was that rice originated only in China and the Yunnan Peninsula and came to India from there. But more recent research has found that rice was domesticated independently in India, specifically the very long grain variety known as Orisa indica, that now Indians like basmati rice and other varieties. In 328 BCE, Alexander the Great invaded India, and one consequence of this was that rice entered the classical European word, and it was originally used as a medicine. And the Greek word orisa comes from the Tamil orisa, meaning berry, and that gives rise to our English rice, the French riz, and so on. Another thing that came to Europe via ancient Greece was the chicken. Now, the chicken was first domesticated, we think, in the Indus Valley. It was certainly domesticated in India. The Greeks saw it in India, and from there it went back to Greece, and in that case, via the Persian Empire. The word for pepper, pipali, from the Sanskrit pipali, entered the European languages as pepper, poivre, and so on. And another word is sugar. Now, I'd like to say a little bit about sugar because that's a very interesting thing. Sugarcane probably originated in Southeast Asia, in the islands, but it was really the Indians who first found a way of taking the juice from the cane and processing it and changing it to different products. The Greek historian Herodotus in 326 BC described stones the color of frankincense, sweeter than figs or honey. And he was probably referring to these pieces of crystallized sugar called khand. And from that, we have our word candy. Another product was jaggery, which is kind of hard pieces of crystal. And the very word sugar comes from the Sanskrit sakara, which was the generic word for sugar at that time. And on the left, you can see a very primitive sugar processing machine, which is still used today in India in some parts, although he's squeezing the juice from the cane. And you even can see this on Devon Avenue, actually. You see people there squeezing juice from the cane. But Indians discovered the way of converting it into useful products. By the 6th century CE, sugar cultivation and processing reached Persia, and from there, the Arabs took it to the Mediterranean. Now, I'd like to say a little bit about vegetarianism, because this, I think, is one of India's most major contributions to the world. In the millennium BCE, the Jains, the Buddhists, and the ascetics in the forest renounced violence and began not eating meat anymore. And the Greek travelers, and there were quite a few Greek travelers who went to India in the 4th and 3rd century BCE, and they were very impressed by the austere lifestyle and the good health of the people they encountered there, especially the ascetics. And actually, there was another Greek, the Greeks had their own vegetarian tradition founded by the philosopher Pythagoras, who actually lived around the same time as the founders of Buddhism and Jainism. But we don't know whether these were separate traditions or whether Pythagoras himself was influenced by Indian ideas. And this is being called one of the great unsolved mysteries of world religion. And it could very well be that there was a convergence there. It's interesting how vegetarianism reached the West, because the early fathers of the church, including St. Jerome, advocated a vegetarian diet, and they knew about the spiritual benefits the Indians had, and they preached it. But later, the church, the post, declared vegetarian as a heresy, based, I guess, on Genesis, which said that after the fall, where Adam and Eve began eating meat. I don't know if that was the cause. But the interest in Indians and India and vegetarian lifestyle really continued to fascinate the West. Marco di Polo, he talked a lot about how healthy the Indians were and how benign their life was. Leonardo da Vinci, he was a vegetarian himself, and there was even a rumor he visited India. And then you had people like Thomas Tryon, who advocated Hindu vegetarianism. Another fellow named John Oswald, who argued for it. And this is a frontispiece of one of his pictures. And he argued for it on environmental grounds, that an argument that we hear today. And then later, Western intellectuals such as Rousseau, Voltaire, Shelley, and so on, they all advocated vegetarianism. So I think this is a very important contribution. I'll say a little bit about India's trade with the East. The east coast of India, especially the region known as Kalinga, now Orissa, were very active in trade. Merchants not only brought spice and textiles, but they also brought Buddhism and Hinduism throughout this entire region. And one remnant of it today, of course, is the island of Bali, which still Hinduism is still practiced. And they certainly had their influence in food, because they took their spices to Southeast Asia. And in return, they also brought things like cloves and cinnamon back, which were brought to India and eventually became part of the spices that were grown there. You can see a couple of influences today in Thai curries. This is just a couple of them. One is the yellow Thai curry paste, which has turmeric, curry powder, and roasted coriander and cumin seed. And another is the musaman curry, which is very unlike most Thai foods, because it's beef or lamb, and the paste contains dried red chilies, ground coriander, cumin, cloves, and whole spices such as anise, which you don't usually see. And you also find the influence of, especially in Vietnam. It's interesting. They have their own curries, and the curry powder that they use in Vietnam is one that we often buy in the Southeast Asian grocery stores, because my husband found it reminded him, it was closest to the curry powder he remembers that the British had when he was a child, and the kind of English style chicken curry that was distinctive at that time. Now, speaking of that, I'd like to turn to England, because there's no doubt that the Indians had a tremendous influence on what the British eat today. In the early 18th century, some returning employees of the East India Company were nostalgia for the food they left behind. And this is how curry became an important part of English foodways. Cross and Blockwell produced the first curry powder in 1784. Others followed. And the first Indian restaurant in England was opened in 1809 at 34 George Street. And you can see the plaque here. And it was owned by this interesting fellow on the right, Saqi-Din Muhammad, who actually introduced Indian-style massage parlors into England, and which actually Queen Victoria even was fond of. So by 1920, London had a handful of Indian restaurants, but the UK restaurant scene really took off after World War II, following large-scale immigration from India, the Indian subcontinents. Many people found employment in the restaurant and catering business. You had hundreds and thousands of these small restaurants called curry houses. You had tandoori restaurants modeled after Delhi's famous Moti Mahal. And then you had a form of cuisine called Balti cuisine, which arose in Birmingham, which is sort of a kind of karai, is what it is. A variation of curry invented in Britain was chicken tikka masala, which you see in the left. It's boneless pieces of chicken marinated in spices and yogurt, and then served in a creamy red-colored sauce. And in 2001, the British Foreign Secretary Robin Cook proclaimed chicken tikka masala a true British national dish, not only because it is the most popular, but because it is a perfect illustration of the way Britain absorbs and adapts external influences. Other dishes the British have adopted are mulligatawny soup, seen at the top, and kedgeree, which is a version of khichdi that I just recently read is one of the Queen Elizabeth's favorite breakfast dishes. And actually, during Queen Victoria's Day, she always had curry served at lunch at her palace in case one of her Indian subjects would happen to visit. And I think her son, King Edward VIII, was also famous for his love of curry. So there's certainly a tradition there. No, today I should just add. Today, this industry is facing a crisis because the second and third generation don't want to go into the restaurant business. You have now the Chancellor of the Exchequer is of Indian origin. You have I think the head of the Bank of England is an Indian of origin. So these restaurants are really shrinking at a rapid rate. These smaller restaurants, but what's happening is, especially, you have these very upscale Indian restaurants that have come up. Such as Tamarind, Benares, Saika in London and elsewhere, and they have gained Michelin stars. And these are very popular, and I'll come back to this later when I look at the restaurant scene in North America. Now, an important item of exchange between India and England, of course, was tea. And here you see a typical picture of this tea being served in India. Tea became a popular drink in the 17th century, but all the tea was imported from China, and it was a great drain on the English treasury, so they were looking for other sources. And tea was actually discovered in the Northeast in the 1820s by Robert Bruce. He found tea bushes growing wild, and there it had been, and it still is eaten as a fermented pickle and also as a drink. And so the government smuggled tea bushes out of China. They also smuggled some people who knew the techniques of growing. And the British tea industry was started first in Assam and then in Darjeeling, South India, and Sri Lanka. And the price of tea, of course, dropped dramatically. And now black tea, which is a tea processed from green tea to make it last longer, had become a popular drink in India. Now, another drink that we owe to India is gin and tonic. When tonic water was invented in the 1860s, it was marketed as an anti-malarial remedy because quinine, which is an ingredient, prevents malaria. So then in the bars of India Club, mixing it with gin made it more palatable and led to the birth of the famous gin and tonic. Now, some people also claim that gin mixed with lime juice which made the famous gimlet cocktail, was also invented in India. And then there's punch. The word punch comes from the word for five in many Indian languages. And basically, it's a combination of different liquors, often including rum. And it was invented by employees of the East India Company. And from there, it came to England. But now turning to another part of the world, India... In 1834, I mentioned that sugar had been transplanted throughout the world. The British declared slavery illegal in the West Indies. Now, the sugar plantations had been worked by African slaves, and most of them refused to continue this very hard work. But the problem was the plantation owners were very well connected. They had links to the government, and they needed workers. So the East India Company came to the rescue by recruiting workers from the poorer parts of India. And I must also add that these plantation owners were compensated extremely generously, what would be the hundreds of millions of dollars today. So these workers became what are called indentured laborers. They signed contracts agreeing to work on a particular estate for 2 terms of 5 years each, at the end of which they could go back to India, or they could stay on, and the vast majority stayed on. And around 90% of these workers came from Bihar and Eastern India. And today in this beautiful museum in the capital of Bihar, there's a whole section devoted to these indentured laborers who left there to India. So between 1834 and 1917, when this system was abolished, 1.4 million people left subcontinent. They went to Guyana, they went to Trinidad, they went to Jamaica. Others went to the island of Mauritius. Some went to Fiji. And in 1852, the system was extended to Southeast Asia to supply workers for the coffee, palm, and rubber plantations. And the people who went to Southeast Asia were mainly Tamils from South India. So there were about 4 or 5 million people that went in that distance. And then later, about 150 Indians went to South Africa to work there, and then others went to East Africa to work on help build the railway into the interior. So wherever these workers went, they brought their food with them, and in the process, they created some wonderful hybrid cuisines. And in Trinidad and Tobago, that I visited several times, the national dish basically is what's called a roti, and roti means both a paratha-like bread, and it also means a popular street food, which is you see on the right, it's a large round bread. It's coated with yellow peas, and it's wrapped around a meat, fish, or vegetable curry, enclosed in wax paper or foil, and it's eaten on the move. And another popular dish is doubles, which is a sandwich of 2 pieces of roti filled with curried chickpeas and topped with chutney and chili sauce, which is very much like the India snack, chole bhature. And Trinidadians use a lot of curry powder in their food. It's usually there's 2 main manufacturers, and it usually has spices like cumin, coriander, turmeric, and chili, which are basically those that you will still find today in Bihar and eastern Uttar Pradesh. And the famous Nobel laureate Naipaul once said that these Indians created a Bihari village in the midst of the Trinidadian jungle. And you certainly see it in the food. You also see it in some of the snacks and some of the street food. It's very similar to what you would see in India. Now, I'm going to turn to another part of the world, which actually has nothing to do directly with India or with the British Empire. But I like talking about this because it's very interesting. And this is Japan and Korea. And in these countries, curry really plays a role in their culinary repertoires. And in a survey conducted, Japanese named curry as one of their favorite home-cooked meals. Curry and rice, and a Japanese curry consists of chunks of meat, carrots, onions, and potatoes in a kind of a brownish, it's really more yellow than this, colored curry powdered flavor, slightly sweetish sauce. And it's often served with a pork cutlet on top. And the curry powder either comes from a curry powder or a ready-made roux. Now, this is so different from what we think of as Japanese food, because it's not very pleasant to look at. It's not like these elegant dishes that, we see in Japanese restaurants with a beautiful presentation. It has a very strong flavor. I think maybe it must fill some kind of a hole in the Japanese culinary repertoire that needs to be filled. And how did curry get to Japan? That's the interesting thing. Well, in the mid-19th century, Japanese ports were open to foreigners, and the British officers of the Royal Navy used to have a curry day every month. The military at that time wanted to encourage meat consumption as a way of building up strength. And the way to do this was to incorporate vegetables, rice, and meat into one inexpensive, substantive meal. And today, the curry tradition is continued by the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, whose ships serve curry every Friday. And each ship has its own curry recipe, and it often features things like coffee, cheese, and ketchup. And 48 of these recipes have been published in a cookbook, which I would like to get, except it's in Japanese. And I had no idea that the Koreans also had curry until the other day. We were in a Korean grocery store, and we found these curry pastes made by this company, Otogi. The Koreans were under Japanese rule in the 20th century, and this may be where the idea of eating curry came from. This company, Otogi, introduced its first ready-to-eat curry in the 1940s. And today it manufactures over 1,000 products, including Australian instant curry and 5 kinds of curry powder, which comes in 3 levels of hotness. And one is very hot, and this reflects the Koreans' tolerance for very spicy dishes. That's kind of interesting. So finally, I'd like to talk about North America. Immigration laws in US, Canada, and also Australia changed in the 1960s to end regional preferences, and today there are over 6 million people of South Asian origin in the US, nearly 2 million in Canada, and nearly 1 million in Australia. So obviously their culinary needs were met by grocery stores, restaurants, entire shopping districts like Jackson Heights in Queens, and in Edison, Journal Square in Jersey City, and of course Devon Avenue in Chicago. And not only that, but regular grocery stores in Chicago at least stock all kinds of Indian products, fruits and vegetables, and frozen and packaged meals and breads. Now, although there were a few Indian restaurants in New York in the 20s, the restaurant scene in the US really expanded in the 1960s with this new wave of immigrants. But in most cases, their dishes featured things that were standard in Indian restaurants at the time. North Indian dishes such as tandoori chicken with naan, butter chicken, saag paneer, samosas. These things were popular. They were modeled after restaurants like Gaylord in India. And then you had South Indian restaurants serving vegetarian dishes. And then there were a few smaller restaurants that served regional cuisines such as Hyderabadi or Gujarati cuisine. But those were certainly much less known. But today this is changing because of a new trend in Indian restaurants, which is kind of similar to those that you find found in Britain. And these one restaurant that you have is Rue, which is in Chicago and is doing very well. And these restaurants are things like New York's Tabla, Devi, an Indian accent, which is a branch of a famous Delhi eatery, Vij in Vancouver, and then I mentioned Rue, which is branches in Delhi, San Francisco, and New York. And their menus reflect trends that you find in India, and which means more beautiful presentation, a return to traditional dishes, an interest in regional dishes, and especially a concern for sustainability and for local ingredients, often combined with techniques that have become popular in the West, such as things that you find at El Bulli, such as freezing things and foams, although that's not really so prevalent anymore. But these are a few of the dishes that you can see, and you can see that beef short rib curry, it looks almost like a beef Wellington, a paneer pinwheel, and a traditional kulcha, but served with green pea and goat cheese. And what's interesting about this is some of the chefs here and in India have actually trained at some of the top restaurants in the world, such as Al Bulli and Noma. And in fact, there were so many Indian chefs that trained at Noma. There was supposed to this year to have been a reunion at Chicago, which would have been great to attend, but obviously it's being postponed because of COVID. So this internet, and by the same token, some American chefs from leading restaurants have gone to India to work at some of the top restaurants there, especially in Mumbai. So I think this internationalization of cuisine has raised the cuisine of all countries, and I hope it will help stimulate the interest in Indian food in this country, which is another issue. But with that, I'd like to end my remarks, and I would like to hear the comments and questions from the speakers, from the discussants. Oops. I'm sorry, I didn't.
should we just go ahead with our questions, Colleen, or how do you want to do this?
I'm happy to ask a question.
It looks
Yeah.
like we've lost
Colleen.
Colleen. Yeah, maybe we have to wait a minute.
Well, I'd like to say what an interesting discussion that was. I had no.
Monica, you have to unmute.
You have to unmute yourself. Someone muted us all, so you'll have to.
Oh, I'm unmuting. How's
There you
that?
go. That's great.
Great. Did my comments about what an interesting discussion that was come through?
Yeah.
That part of it.
Yeah, I didn't know about cond and sugar and eggplant. All
Oh, very
fascinating.
interesting. It shows that.
Oh, I think we've been muted again. I think we have to manually unmute ourselves.
Okay, there we are.
Yep.
It just shows that the idea of authenticity shouldn't be taken literally. That
Right.
something is in one place and not influenced by other things.
Yeah, the kind of intermixing and fusion and influencing of other cultures has been happening for centuries and centuries.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
nothing
Hi,
new.
Colleen.
Sorry, I don't know what happened.
Uh-oh.
Oh,
I apologize.
Do you have headphones to plug in?
No, I don't.
Oh boy. Maybe you just need to mute yourself, and then we need to mute ourselves, or
In any case,
oh.
you sound like the Wizard of Oz.
Mm-hmm.
do you have questions for me?
Oh.
I do. Oh boy. Maybe we need to ask them and then take ourselves out of it.
No,
It's a feedback of some kind. It's from your mic, probably.
yeah, I think can you hear me now? I think it's working.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Well, you're still.
No, it's still
It's still
terrible.
feedback.
Feedback.
Oh dear. Can you hear me though?
Oh, yes.
Okay, I think. Okay.
Slightly better. Well, I'll start off by saying I'd love to hear more about how South Asian or Indian food influence lasted in southern and eastern Africa.
Yeah, well, what happened was, I think in South Africa especially, you have large Indian population, especially in Durban, which has thing. And one of the dishes you have there is called the bunny chow, which is basically a curry wrapped in bread. And so you also find a lot of curries in South Africa. You find curry powder. So I think it's had quite an influence there.
Thanks. I know a friend who was doing anthropological work in Dar es Salaam and said that he had great Indian food there too. So.
Yes, Tanzania. I think that was mainly the restaurant workers, the railway workers who settled in East Africa. And Bruce, you've been to Tanzania, I think, haven't you?
Yes. Yeah. And Indian food is all over, made by native African peoples and Indians and everybody. Well, I was in Uganda, for example, when they expelled under Idi Amin the Indian population. But if you go to the markets and restaurants, a lot of curry and Indian dishes.
So the influence remained.
Yeah.
I have a couple of questions. I was going to ask about tea, and I think I probably will later, but I'm more curious now, Colleen. I heard you referring to curry powder so many times, and yet none of my friends in India would be caught dead using curry powder. It's rather every cook makes, they grind their own spices basically based on what mom or grandma or mother-in-law taught them how to do, how to cook. So it's going to differ not just regionally, but even from household to household to some extent. So, and yet, of course, curry powder. I could go to the grocery store and buy, 8 or 10 different kinds of curry powder here. Although, I'm not going to tell any of my Indian friends that.
Well, I think there's some dishes like that have to be made with curry powder. For example, the classic sort of Anglo-Indian chicken curry.
Well,
You can't use spices for that. It has to be made with old-fashioned curry powder. And as I said, the one that's sold in the Vietnamese stores seems to be the closest. And I think, if you go with there's hundreds of different kinds of spice mixtures. Maybe I shouldn't say
Right.
curry powder, but you have shan, and you have for everything you
masala.
can possibly imagine. So, but I think you're right. I mean, but the whole word curry is very controversial. I don't object to it, frankly, and I think it's very convenient, but some people don't like it.
Yeah, and it also refers to a completely different thing. There's the curry leaf that you get in some regional cuisines that, it has nothing to do with, what we think of as the turmeric laden mixture that, that you get now.
Can I say parenthetically, I have a curry leaf tree.
Oh,
It's about this big. We keep it in a pot, and we bring it into the winter.
Really?
And and it's great. I'm hooked on curry leaves.
I wish we had it. That would be great.
Well, I found it in an international store down here in Southern Illinois, and took it home, and it's been growing for a decade.
wow.
So I think you should try to find one and grow one inside.
I think one of the things I didn't talk about, which is, the whole point of the whole status of Indian food in the U.S. And, Indian food's never really caught on here the way it has in Britain. And I think there's a friend of ours, Professor Chris Ray at NYU, who's done a lot of very data-driven studies of this. And if you look at how much people are willing to pay for an Indian meal compared with Japanese or French, I mean, there's only a certain level beyond which, as if, this is some kind of inferior cuisine, which it isn't. And the question is, why has it never really caught on? And I think one reason is because of the very diversity. I mean, what is Indian food? There really is no such thing. It's like saying European food. I mean, would you have Finnish and you have Italian? But so that's one thing. And so it's become very standardized around this kind of North Indian food. And then people don't really know how to prepare these other meals. The other thing is, I don't think that the Americans don't have the same emotional and cultural ties with Britain as with India as the Brits do. So it's something kind of alien to them. I mean, it's not part of their consciousness or their subconscious. And also, people like spicy food more and more. So here, our taste for spiciness is met by Mexican and Thai food and Korean food. So India's food's never really found its niche. And I hope that these really upscale new restaurants I mentioned will multiply, and that people will develop more of an interest in Indian food.
Well, Monica's an expert on this. Do you think that chicken tikka masala will join the ranks of General Tso's chicken, orange
it already
chicken?
has in England. I'm not sure how much it's going to do in the United States, just because, some people call it the national dish of England. I'm pushing for khichdi as being the big hit in the United States. I didn't know that Queen Elizabeth eats it every morning.
Apparently.
When I interviewed singing and TV star Zooey Deschanel at the Beard Awards a few years ago, I said, "What are you excited about these days?" She's like, "Khichdi. I love eating it." And that's, of course, rice and mung beans and, a certain level of spice. Some people like it very, very bland. They say it, should be bland for kids, but it's also life-giving and healing.
It's comfort food.
Yeah, it's totally comforting.
Yeah.
And speaking of trees, the Moringa tree, which I think is the Shobanjana in India, is becoming huge with health nuts in the United States. I've got 2 Moringa trees right on my porch here, and I eat those leaves in hopes that I'll become a superwoman, but another Indian plant that people are using in their food.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, to change the subject a little bit, to get my tea question in, because I was glad you talked a little bit about its history, because we all just think that's where it came from, I guess. And I read a couple of books actually on the development of the whole tea trade, and it's got a complicated history and a little skullduggery involved in there a little bit and all of that. But thinking about tea now, I think a little bit about the so-called pizza effect. You know, pizza started in Italy and then it went to the US, and now American pizza is popular back. You know, Domino's is in Italy now. I think probably the best tea I've ever had is while traveling on Indian railways, you know, in the little clay cups and all of that. But now there's Starbucks in India. And as I last left India shortly ahead of the pandemic, and as I was leaving, I poked my head into the Starbucks in the airport, and they have, I mean, it's exactly the same menu that you would find anywhere in the US, including chai tea latte, my favorite triple redundancy. And you know, I was talking to one of the kids working there, you know, probably college student, local guy, and you know, I asked if they had chai, and he says, "Oh, madam, would you like a chai tea latte?" And I couldn't believe he was saying that. And yeah, I still don't know what to make.
Well, the whole thing of chai actually was kind of, it was created after basically after World War II. There was a glut of very cheap tea in the market, and the Indian Tea Board wanted to find a way of getting Indians to drink more tea, because it wasn't a tea drinking country. It was basically North India drank milk. And so what they did is, by adding all this milk and then later spices and things, it made it kind of a mass drink in India. So it's by not a deep rooted tradition. It's kind of ironic actually that it came back that way. Except in the Northeast, where they did have it.
Yeah.
Well, except in the East, in Calcutta, they drink tea like we do here, like in a normal fashion, like that. So, so does anyone have any other questions? I don't know.
Do Canadians have a curry tradition?
No, but you know, you actually, it's kind of ironic that now in Canada, I would say that if two things that are the national dishes are samosas and rotis, because the main influence is certainly people from the West Indies. You find samosas, I mean, everywhere. And my own mother in her 90s, you asked her what she wanted, she would say samosas. We go to Samosa King, there'd be about 30 different kinds of samosas. And then you find a lot of Trinidadian rotis, you find Jamaican things, and they're all over the place. And it's really kind of changed Canadian food habits, which were basically very British and not too interesting. And I think it's all part of this this trend towards spicy food that people like.
And we shouldn't forget the national Irish drunk food of curry chips.
Actually, the worst curry I've ever had was in an Irish pub in Chicago. I won't mention it. And it was awful. It was white and it had no flavor. And apparently it was actually imported from Ireland. This is what I can't believe it, but why are you laughing? Do you know what I'm referring to, Bruce?
No, I've never had that. I've had something almost as bad, in my opinion. It's called currywurst in Germany.
I don't know why people like that so much. I find it overly sweet and terrible.
I've
It's
never even
terrible.
heard
And
of it.
the Germans dote upon it. I mean,
Wow.
they argue about where its origins are. I've met
And what
German
is it exactly?
recently. Pardon?
What is it?
It was invented after World War II by a German woman who was working rebuilding Berlin, collecting bricks. And of course, Germans sausage culture.
Sure.
But some British soldiers apparently gave her some packets of powdered curry, and she decided to put it on sausage with bread, and began sell. And it became instantly popular. She began selling it everywhere, and it's a standard German dish now.
And the biggest crime is it's always served with a very sweet ketchup.
Yeah, that's another thing. I can't believe this. But the Germans argue about which is the best one. Somebody just told me, I was talking to a bunch of Germans who said, "Oh, you have to go to Essen," which is an appropriate name. That's the best. That's where it's invented.
I think there was a movie made actually about it. There's actually a movie about the origin of curry, and there's two stories about its invention. It's a very heated discussion.
Huh.
Well, anyway, it's not Indian.
Well, they serve it in Chicago sometimes at the Christmas festival. I had it there.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if we're supposed to have questions from the viewing audience.
Where will those show up?
I don't know. I'm afraid to do anything because I'll end up taking myself out again.
Yeah.
Dr. Collinson, could you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes.
There is a question from Mrs. Namarta Dalela. She's asking, can you please tell us a little bit about how tea was advertised after the tea gardens came up in India and became a national drink?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I don't know if I heard you, tea as a mass drink in India was really came about after World War II, when the tea market the world tea market declined, and there was a great surplus of cheap Indian, less quality Indian tea in the market. So the Indian Tea Board wanted to find a way to make tea more of a popular drink in India, and they did this by kind of almost inventing chai. I mean, there was spiced tea that people had. It wasn't that it didn't exist. But in this case, they did a mass market of encouraging people to have tea, mix it with milk, which people did drink, and spices. So that really is what popularized it in India. It wasn't really a mass drink until then. And they put all kinds of things in tea. Once in Rajasthan, I was even served tea with red chilies in it, which was really, really surprising.
Oh, thank you very much. That is very interesting. Now, rest of the people, rest of the discussants can please go ahead if they have something to add.
Yeah. Okay, does anyone have anything to add? Maybe I would like to sum up what you thought about my talk and what you learned from it that you didn't know before. That would help me. Okay.
Well, I didn't know the things about sugar, about sort of perfecting the processing of sugar into candies, and then the word sahar or shakar in so many languages coming from Sanskrit, was it? I didn't know the thing about khichdi. I didn't know about kand, or the word for eggplant spreading across the world like that. So many interesting points.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't realize that about eggplant either.
You didn't?
Nope.
No?
I was interested to hear that about eggplant because since it's a nightshade, right? So it's related to tomatoes and potatoes, which are not Indian originally. So yeah, that was a surprise to me too.
Well, as you know, Rebecca, when when tomatoes came, they called it vilayati begun. They called tomatoes foreign eggplants. Now, whether they knew they were related to the same family, I don't know, but it was kind of, and they adapted pretty quickly. Things like the potato, again, they were alu, which meant a tuber. So these things really kind of replaced what was already in Indian cuisine. So tomato became a source of sourness. Potatoes started replacing roots, but it never became a staple as it did in Europe because they already had like wheat and rice as a staple. And then chilies, of course, were adapted because there was already a source of heat, which was the pepper. So yeah, I think eggplant is absolutely the most, what's the word I want? The most universal Indian vegetable. I think if anything were to sum up India's vegetable, it would be the eggplant. Just as the mango would be the fruit.
Yeah.
It's so versatile.
Do you have a favorite eggplant dish? I love the pickle, the sweet pickle. Maybe it's redundant, brinjal eggplant. And of course, I love baigan bharta, if that's how it's pronounced.
Yeah. Eggplant has the advantage of just absorbing whatever you cook it in. So it has really kind of no flavor of its own, but it very easily takes up whatever it's cooked in. One thing I find interesting about India is the whole concept, the whole thing of milk drinking, because I once saw a table of lactose intolerance in India. And it's very, I've never been able to find it again, but North India, of course, they're not lactose intolerant.
Right.
Milk is really the basic drink in the Punjab. In other parts of India, they are, but yogurt they can digest. So yogurt is kind of the way that dairy products are taken in India. And this may be related to the whole, Indo-European entry into India, which is a controversial topic, but I think you could relate it to lactose intolerance.
Hey, Colin, why do you think India doesn't have an aged cheese industry or tradition?
Oh, it does now, certainly. It's becoming, but these rich people who've made their pile now are having farms, and they have, what do they call them in Delhi? So there's quite a lot of it coming up, but it's not a tradition. You're right. It's borrowed from the West. I guess because yogurt was the way of having fermented dairy products.
Miss Collinson, you would like to throw some light on paneer, which is a milk product used in many Indian dishes.
Yes, it is. It is, and I think
it is a start. It is a sort of
India, or if it came from the Middle East, because the whole technique of separating milk and then taking the curd and then pressing it is certainly widely used. It may have come from northern India, or maybe even the Pakistan, Afghanistan region originally, but it is quite ancient.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. Good.
Well, I want to thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak on this occasion of the 75th anniversary of Indian independence, and it was a great honor. I apologize for the technical difficulties, which I think I caused by leaving the PowerPoint instead of going back. But thank you for your patience, and I really appreciate Rebecca Manring and Bruce Craig and Monica Eng for taking time to join me in this and to add their comments and questions.
Thank you. It's been very enlightening.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, you're
Thank
very
you.
welcome.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure to have Dr. Colin San, an icon of culinary history, in the second episode of the lecture series to commemorate India's 75 years of independence. Viewers can certainly learn more and benefit by reading a lot of literature created by her. Thank you so much, and we thank you, Professor Rebecca Manring, Monica Eng, and Dr. Bruce Craig for the contribution you have made to this webinar. and we hope to have more lectures in the coming days, and hope we will have scholars and researchers like you, and learn more about India's history and India's culture. Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.